Hi everyone. So it's a shame that I can't be giving you this lecture personally, but hopefully I will get the chance to meet you at some point. My name is Dr. David Lawson and I'm one of the teaching focus lecturers here in the Biological Sciences Department. Before becoming a lecturer here, I also studied in this department during my PhD, looking at the complexity of floral signals and how these multisensory displays affect the foraging behavior of pollinators, and I used bumblebees as a model organism. So today's lecture sample is quite close to my heart. This snippet that I'll be giving you is from a lecture that I give to our first years in the unit Diversity of Life. And in this Diversity of Life unit, we look at a range of life forms from single-celled organisms up to vertebrates like us, and then beyond, looking at things from at an ecosystem level. So this snippet will be from a lecture that I give on insects. In terms of what my aims are for this lecture sample, I'd like to introduce you all to the class Insecta and look over some of the key features that make insects such a successful group. And in terms of the learning outcomes, so these are things that I'd like you to be able to walk away from the lecture with. I'd like you to be able to characterize the key aspects of the insect body plans, what's going where. I'd like you also to be able to detail the insect exoskeletons, wings, feeding strategies, and life cycles. So these facets of insect biology that relate to their success. And I'd like you to be able to explain the advantages of these particular features. So here we have a representation of the tree of life. We have us over here, and then down towards the left, we have the insects alongside other groupings of organisms like the crustaceans. And down here, we have our last common ancestor. So we last shared a common ancestor with insects around 700 million years ago. Insects provide us with one of the largest and most diverse groups of metazoans, or animals, and there are close to 2 million species of insects. And this is thought to be a conservative estimate, and there might be as much as 20 to 50 million undescribed species of insects. So a really diverse and abundant group. Even the beetle family alone has over 350,000 different known species. So that constitutes around 40% of all described insects and 25% of all known animal life forms. So just the beetles alone are a massively diverse and numerous group. The famous evolutionary biologist John Haldane was once asked what we might learn about God by studying the natural world, to which he replied that God has an inordinate fondness for beetles just because there's so many of them in so many different shapes. So insects, as I said, are a very successful group of animals, particularly on dry land, and most insects are terrestrial, but you do find some aquatic insects, insects that spend part of their lifestyle underwater, or insects that hunt underwater and spend most of their time on the surface. Looking more closely at some characteristics of insects, we find that they have this body plan that's divided into 3 separate regions, and we call these regions tagmata. So we have the head region, the thorax region in the middle, and then the end of the insect is known as the abdomen. From this thorax region, we have 3 pairs of legs extending outwards. You tend to not find any appendages on this 3rd abdomen section, but as well on the thorax of adults, you usually find 2 pairs of wings extending outwards. It can be quite difficult to see in certain insects where these appendages are coming from. So for instance, with the legs, if you look at these insects on the diagram here, it can be quite difficult to see where the legs are extending outwards. For instance, the ladybird that you see on the far left column, it's difficult to see that the legs are coming out of the thorax, but on the next slide, you'll see where they're extending outwards from. So here's the underside of a ladybird here. And when you look underneath this shell, you can see these 3 legs extending outwards from this central section. So although it can be quite difficult to see that the legs are extending outwards from the thorax from one angle, if you look on the underside, it becomes clear. So here we have this closer look at this three-part structure of the insect body plan. The example here is a locust. At the front end of the locust, you can see their head. In the middle of the locust body plan is this thorax, and then towards the end, we have this abdomen. Extending outwards from the thorax, we have these three pairs of legs and two pairs of wings as well. Looking more closely at the head, we have quite a few different sensory units. So we have these compound eyes, which are found in most insects, and these compound eyes are made out of thousands and thousands of these repeating units or lenses, which we call ommatidia. And each of these ommatidia functions as a separate visual receiver. So the image that the insects are seeing is using inputs from all of these different ommatidia, putting them together and producing a mosaic-like image. So the more ommatidia you have, or the more of these lenses, the higher the resolution of this image. Locusts have relatively few ommatidia, so the image that is produced is quite grainy. But if you looked at something like a bee, for instance, they'll have more ommatidia and a higher resolution in the image that's produced. They also have these three additional single lens eyes at the top of their head known as ocelli, and you find these in quite a lot of insect species. So these are very simple light detectors, and it's thought that these ocelli are used in flying insects for balancing themselves out when they're in flight. So what they'll do is they'll line these ocelli up with the horizon, and this helps to keep the insects level as they're flying through their environment. You also see this antenna from the locust head. This antenna is very important to the biology of insects, and this is their primary means of olfaction, or their sense of smell. Sometimes in different insects it's used for different things, but primarily this is where the insects pick up on chemical cues from their environment. We also have down here the mandibles of the locust. So these are hardened body parts of the locust that are used for cutting or crushing pieces of food. And there's also these maxillae or palps that are not as hard as the mandibles, and the locust can use these for manipulating or tasting food. Here you can see some of these structures on another insect. So this is a miner bee we have here. You can see these large compound eyes either side of the miner bee's head, made up of these thousands upon thousands of repeating ommatidia. At the top of the miner bee's head, you can see these additional single lens eyes, these ocelli, and you can also see these antennae as well, these structures that are used for smelling in insects. So on this slide, we have 4 key features that have contributed to the success of insects. We'll be going through these features one by one in some detail, and we're going to be starting with the exoskeleton, which has been a considerable advantage to insects, providing with this strong and light form of support for their internal organs, and also as this rigid frame which helps for muscular attachments and for specific actions in insects like flight and walking. So here we have a transverse section of an insect. So it's as if we've just chopped an insect in half through the abdomen, and it shows some of the common features that we see on the inside of the insects. So these thick, dark lines that you can see here are the muscles, and these muscles are attached to ridge-like ingrowths of the exoskeletons, which we call apodemes. So these apodemes provide attachment points for the muscles, and you can imagine if you contract these muscles, shortening them, that will pull on these various other sections of the exoskeleton to aid in things like walking or flight. When it comes to walking in insects, insects have these 6 legs that are arranged into 3 pairs, and this is excellent for terrestrial animals and terrestrial locomotion because it retains this very stable support system. So in insects, these 6 legs constitute 2 stable tripods. And when an insect is walking, it will move one of these tripods forward and the other one will stay still, and then it will swap. So that tripod that was moved forward before will be the stationary one. And this is perhaps easier to see in this GIF here of this ant, which is moving these 2 tripods, a red tripod and a blue tripod forward. And this system has been copied in robots really successfully for traversing uneven ground. So insects have evolved a really efficient form of locomotion when it comes to their walking. One of the main characteristics of this insect cuticle, or this exoskeleton, is its resistance to tearing. And this is down to the structure of the exoskeleton. And structurally, the exoskeleton is made up of this protein matrix. And in this matrix, you have these rods of chitin running throughout. And the exoskeleton is made up of lots of different layers. And in each one of these layers, the chitin rods are arranged at a slightly different angle, and they sort of spiral through these different layers, and that makes it really tough and difficult to tear. Also, these exoskeletons go through this process of tanning a protein, which uses an enzyme to harden the protein in the exoskeleton. So that's just an additional way where you can get this increased resistance to tearing in the exoskeleton. Often there will be this layer of wax molecules on the surface of the exoskeleton, which makes the exoskeleton waterproof. And additionally, insect eggs even have this protective cuticle coat when laid, which prevents desiccation or drying out in the eggs. Finally, another aspect of the exoskeleton that we often see is the presence of this elastic protein known as resolin. So this resolin is a rubber-like protein with almost 100% elasticity, so that the energy stored when you're compressing this resolin is released as kinetic energy as it returns to its original state. So you'll often find blocks of this resolin occurring in the thorax, and they're particularly important in insects in the articulation of their wings, but they're also used in particular insects, for instance, fleas, for storing up the energy which they'll use to jump many times their own body length. So they store up this energy in the resolin, and this energy is released as it goes back to its original shape. So next up, we're going to look at insect wings, a really important feature in insect biology. Before getting into wings, it is worth mentioning that not all insects have wings. So for instance, on the left of the slide here, you can see some silverfish, and silverfish are apterygotes, which means that they are primitively wingless, or that they separated from other insects before the evolution of wings, and therefore are older than insects that do have wings. Then we also have some insects like ants and termites that only have wings at certain points in their life cycle. So you might be familiar with Flying Ant Day, where all these kind of prince and princess ants leave their nests and start flying around to mate and then start up new colonies. So these ants only have wings at certain points in their life cycle. And then there's also some insects that have lost their wings secondarily. So We call these derived species, and these are species that are descended from insects that did have wings, but over the course of their evolutionary history, they've lost them as their wings are no longer useful for their particular lifestyle. So examples of these include lice and fleas. So species that are descended from insects that did have wings, but now no longer have them. The evolution of wings has aided insect diversity considerably. So insects were the first flying animals and are the only group of animals which have evolved the power of flight without having to sacrifice a pair of their limbs. So if you think about the wings of birds and bats, these have evolved from the forelimbs. So birds and bats have essentially sacrificed these forelimbs to gain their wings. But for insects, the wings are a new evolutionary development of the thorax and are not homologous with previous appendages. For example, they're not derived structurally or developmentally from legs or other appendages. They're a whole new evolutionary development, and we call this an apomorphy. So the presence of the two wings is standard in insects, and it is modified in many insects, but generally we see that insects have this fore-wing pair at the front and this hind-wing pair of wings at the back. Some groups of insects have a different arrangement with their wings. So for beetles, for instance, their forewings have become hardened over time and they've evolved into this protective cover called an elytra. So this elytra structure covers the hind wings, which are normal flying wings in beetles, and they cover these hind wings when the insect is on the ground. So most beetles fly, even very large species, but there are also some flightless beetle species, and in these flightless beetles, it's often the case that this elytra, or this hard outer shell, will be fused together. Here's a GIF of a ladybird, just so you can see this modified forewing, this elytra, kind of opening up to reveal the hind wings underneath. You also see some other modifications of wings in different groups of insects. So for dipteran flies, the hind wing is modified and it's been reduced to this small stalk structure that we call a haltea. And this haltea acts as a balance organ during flight. So as the forewings of the insect move up and down, this haltea structure will move down and up. And this creates this gyroscopic force, utilizing the Coriolis effect, which stabilizes the insect when it's in flight. You can kind of see the haltea going up and down as the wings of the insect go down and up here. So in certain flies, if you think about a hoverfly, for instance, they have this amazing maneuverability and balance, zipping around from different spots and staying really still. And that's one of the advantages of this haltea, which are these modified hind wings. So there we had some examples of modified wings in beetles and flies. In your typical wing structure, you have these wings that are made out of very thin layers of cuticle or exoskeleton. And between these upper and lower layers of cuticle, you have these vein structures running throughout the wing. And these wing venation patterns are fixed according to the species, and that makes them really, really useful when it comes to taxonomy or identification, as each species will have a particular pattern of wing veins, making them really useful if the other morphological characteristics in the insects are similar between different species. There's also been this process of simplification of these wing vein patterns throughout the evolutionary history of insects. So for instance, dragonflies, which are quite primitive insects, they evolved quite early on. They have these very complicated net-like patterns of veins that you can see on the left of the slide here. But more derived insects, or insects that have come about more recently in their evolutionary history, have these much more simple venation patterns like flies, or even more recently hymenopterans, which includes bees and wasps. The more derived insects also have this additionary feature, which are these hinges at the wing base, which allows the wings to fold back over the abdomen. So these two images at the bottom, you can see a dragonfly on the left and a damselfly on the right. You can see how the dragonfly's wings stick out to the side, whereas the damselfly's wings actually fold back over the body. And this keeps the wings safe and out of the way when they're resting or walking. And you might not think it, but this is a really important evolutionary event, as it allowed insects to explore new habitats. So you could imagine it would be difficult for the dragonfly to burrow into the earth or move through some thick leaf litter, but it would be easier for the damselfly to do that, as it's got this more streamlined shape with its wings folded over. So this is considered to be quite an important evolutionary event. So that's it for wings, but now we'll be moving on to the insect feeding strategy. So insects have been on land since the Carboniferous period, around 359 to 299 million years ago. So they've been around a really long time. And during this enormous time frame, they've evolved to feed on almost all types of plant and animal matter. So the insect diet is extremely varied. They feed on a huge variety of plants, some of which we as humans grow for our own consumption, and that can create some tension between us and the insects, which at times we consider pests. For instance, they can feed on crops like the locust you can see here feeding on some wheat. You also find mealybugs, which are common garden pests, up at the top. But they can also feed on livestock as well. So the far right image here are some maggots feeding on the live flesh of a sheep in a condition called myiasis. And the sheep would quickly die from this if not treated. So some insects are serious parasites in livestock production systems, causing animal welfare issues as well as dramatic economic loss for farmers as well. Insects also feed on both vertebrates and other invertebrates. Many species feed on blood and tissue fluids. If you think about nectar feeders like pollinators, or blood feeders like mosquitoes. There's a lot of research effort going into insects as biological control agents as well. So using certain insects to control the populations of other insects. However, it can have very mixed effects and cause dramatic ecological disturbance. So using these insects as biological control agents can have really unpredictable outcomes as well. So you have to be very sure that what you're doing by introducing insects into a system, you have to make really sure that you're not going to upset the system at large. As insects are utilizing all these various food sources, we see a lot of variation in the feeding structures or the mouth parts of the insects, and this relates to their diet. So the insects will be feeding on different things, and they'll have a mouth part that reflects that diet. The more primitive mouth parts are adapted for chewing, and you'll see these in insects like dragonflies and crickets and beetles. At the top, you can see an image which shows these mandibular or crushing, chewing mouth parts. But you'll also see mouth parts in insects that have evolved for piercing or sucking. And this has occurred independently in various insect orders for the purposes of nectar feeding or blood feeding. One really important aspect of the insect feeding strategy is they feed on different foods at different stages of their lives. So the bottom two pictures here, we have the caterpillar stage of the cabbage white butterfly, and on the right side you can see the cabbage white butterfly in its adult form. In its larval form, the caterpillars feed on cabbage and is a serious pest. But in the adult form, this butterfly form, it feeds on nectar from various flowers and has completely different mouth parts than the larval stage. This is an important feature in that it reduces competition between the juveniles and the adults of the same species. And it's thought that this is just another reason why insects are so successful, because they've limited this competition between the juvenile forms and the adult forms. Because of this benefit, the most successful insects have larval stages that differ considerably from the adult forms. So they can exploit different habitats and use different food sources. There are essentially three types of life cycle found in insects. We have the ametabolous life cycle, the hemimetabolous life cycle, and the holometabolous life cycle. And that's what we'll look at in this final section of the key features of insects, these separate life cycles. Before we talk about these different life cycles, it's worth talking about some of the diversity that we see in insects when it comes to their reproductive strategies. So in some insects, we see parental care, and this is the case with insects and certain types of tunneling dung beetles, which supervise their developing eggs. Some insects show this behavior called viviparity, and that's where they give birth to live larvae or live young. And this is seen in aphids that you can see at the top of the slide here. And also you can see this in the tsetse fly giving birth to a live larvae to the left of the slide. Some are even parthenogenic, such as aphids and ants, and this means that they can produce young without mating. So for instance, at the top you see this aphid giving birth to live young, and it's essentially cloning itself because it didn't need to mate in order to produce this young. Even stranger with the aphid is that when an aphid is born, it's already got a developing embryo inside it. So aphids essentially give birth to their own granddaughters, so they have this Russian doll-like system of giving birth. There are also social insects as well, like ants, bees, and wasps, where the majority of the colony are sterile workers, and they'll just have one or very few individuals that are responsible for reproduction, these queens within the colony. So moving on to these particular life cycles, here's a diagram that represents the ametabolous life cycle, which you find in some insects such as the wingless silverfish. Within this life cycle, there's no metamorphosis. There's only this very simple development. Once the insect has hatched from the egg, the juvenile looks just like a miniature version of the adult, and the young looks almost exactly the same as the adult, and they just grow bigger and bigger until they reach that adult size. Next up is the hemimetabolous life cycle. So insects which have a hemimetabolous life cycle have a developmental system in which the juveniles are more or less similar to the adults. They get bigger after each molt, and in the final molt into the adult, this is where you get the development of the reproductive organs, the adult coloration, and the full development of the wings. So the juvenile stages don't have any wings, they just have these simple wing pads. The juvenile stages are all fairly similar to one another, and it's in this final molt to the adult that results in the most changes. And in insects with this hemimetabolous life cycle, the larvae and the adults live in the same habitats and eat the same things. Finally, we have the holometabolous life cycles. And in insects with a holometabolous life cycle, we have this full metamorphosis, and this is the most derived type of life cycle in insects. So it's come about more recently than the other life cycles. And in these species, the adult is very different from the larvae. The larvae are so different, in fact, that we often give them completely different names. For example, a beetle larvae is known as a grub, a fly larvae is known as a maggot, a butterfly larvae is known as a caterpillar. So we even have different names for these different stages of their life cycle. The larvae also feed on different foods to the adult. They lack the compound eyes and antennae that we find in the adult forms, and also the mouth parts are usually completely different. Unlike the hemimetabolous insects, the wing pads are not present at all in the juvenile stages. The egg hatches into a larvae, which grows through several molts, growing in size each time, feeding and growing and molting, and eventually it develops into this pupa. So this stage of the insect life cycle, which is stationary, and inside the pupa, this major metamorphosis is taking place, and eventually the adult form emerges from this pupa. In this slide that you can see here, you can see the metamorphosis of a butterfly from the larvae to the pupa to the adult. So in the middle, you can see this pupa stage, and this is normally immobile, so it doesn't move, and it's often cryptic. And what I mean when I say cryptic is that often blends into the background. So within the pupa, there's this dramatic reorganization occurring into the adult forms. You get the development of the gonads and the wings. And the biggest orders of insects are holometabolous. So this is the most common life cycle that you find in insects. These holometabolous insects outnumber the other insects 10 to 1, which just highlights how successful these holometabolous insects are. Just because I thought it was worth sharing with you guys, here's an example of a particular holometabolous insect known as a botfly. So it's a dipteran fly, and I consider these botflies to be nightmare creatures because what they do is they'll lay eggs on mosquitoes, and then when a mosquito feeds on an animal like an unsuspecting human, these eggs will drop off and then they'll bury into the hole that the mosquito has made in the flesh of the animal. So this is actually my hand, and what I'm holding in my hand there are 3 botfly larvae that had just been removed from my butt cheek, and they had been in my butt cheek for around 2 weeks by that time, which was a not particularly pleasant experience. But I just wanted to highlight that as an example of one of these holometabolous insects, and also to show you guys where a degree in biology might take you. I'm going to round off the lecture just talking about some of the effects of insects. So it's very difficult to estimate the importance of insects, but we do know that they're extremely important when it comes to pollination. Around 2/3 of the flowering plants that exist depend on insects for pollination, which means that they have this dramatic impact on our food supply and on our crops as well. But there are also a multitude of other ecosystem services which insects provide, which are essential in agricultural ecosystems. For instance, nutrient cycling, the formation of soil fertility, decomposition, pest control, not to mention them being a vital maintainer of other species as part of diverse food webs. Insects are also important parasites of livestock and humans, as we saw in the previous slide, and they can act as vectors for disease in humans and domesticated animals. For instance, there's malaria and yellow fever that's carried by mosquitoes, sleeping sickness that's carried by tsetse flies, typhus carried by lice, and bubonic plague carried by fleas, amongst many more. You also find insects which act as pests, doing direct damage by eating plants or indirect damage by spoiling our food supplies. So there are a whole host of effects that insects have on us and the natural world around us. So there's no getting away from the fact that insects have this dramatic effect on the world. So that's it for our sample lecture on insects. I hope you enjoyed it. And I also hope that you're all safe and that I get the chance to meet you all at some point in the future. See you later.